forget. Recording in progress. So for this part, we're going to talk a little bit about light intensity versus exposure, because there is an exposure control in the Arnold lights, or actually in the Maya lights that have Arnold attributes also. And I want to just define the difference between the two, because in our class, we're not using exposure. We are only using intensity. And we'll get into doing the demos. We've got our basic light types here. We've got a directional light, which you can see the light rays, the icon, the light rays are parallel. That's meant to simulate our sun. Got a point light, that's omnidirectional, shines in all directions. That is meant to be like a bare light bulb. We have a spotlight, which is kind of like a flashlight, car headlights, a projector. It is designed to project light in a direction, but not parallel. Because of that cone, the light's going to fan out. And then we have an area light, which is meant to simulate a broad surface of light, like a door, a window, for example, our projector screen. That would be a perfect example of an area light. It's a big surface that is reflecting light back in. So area lights can be used as reflectors and also as light emitting surfaces too. All right, so let's talk a little bit about light intensity versus exposure. So light intensity is basically the way real world light is calculated in what's called a linear fashion. Now, linear simply means, so if we have a chart here, we got one for intensity and one for exposure. All right, so intensity would be, and this were, say down here, this is 0, where there's no light at all. And then this is some number. No idea what that number is. Yes. Okay. So I am. Thank you. Oh, and I'm also frozen in Zoom. All right. So now, there we go. Thank you. Kitty was trying to get my attention. I think I still have it paused. All right. So everybody's good now. All right. So fortunately, anybody watching this archive, that will not be the case. They won't have a frozen screen. But just for the sake of that, let me go back to my screen here, talk about the light types again. So here's the directional light. Well, actually, wait, you saw that. That was frozen, wasn't it? Oh, okay. Then you really didn't miss much. Okay, except for here. There we go. All right, so I'm glad we sorted that all out. All right, so intensity, bottom left, 0, top, a number. Could be any number, 1,000,000. Could be just the level of intensity or brightness. So the way that real world light is calculated is in a linear fashion. There are no abrupt changes. There are no big, huge jumps between units. The units are really, really small, if they exist at all. It's basically just an even line. Now, let's talk about exposure. Exposure works a lot like a camera does with camera exposure, which is basically how long is the shutter open and what speed is the shutter open and closing. And that lets light in. The opening itself for exposure, the aperture, that lets light in what they call stops. And stops usually allow twice as much light or half the light to come in to the camera sensor. And that's the way exposure works. Exposure works on a camera usually with these steps or jumps between absolute zero and some number. So we got a number here, but instead of going in a line, we might start with exposure. We might start with our intensity here, but it kind of plateaus until we get to the next step. So each step is designed to let twice as much light in. Now, in reality, though, it exponentially increases your light by the power of 2. When we measure real-world light, we usually measure it in lumens or candelas. You go to a store to buy a box of light bulbs, they're in lumens. A lot of times, for film photography, they might go candelas, which is just another unit of measurement. But the idea is that these units can be quite large. If you go to, say, for example, see, what's a common one? I think 60-watt light bulb is common. I think I got that here. Yeah, 60-watt light bulb is usually about 800 lumens. 75, it's somewhere around 950, 1,000. You go 100 watt, it's usually like 1,100, 1,200 lumens. All right, that's the amount of energy. Actually, let me just keep this one here. All right, so 500-watt light bulb, for example, can be 9,500 lumens. The bigger the number, the higher the intensity, the more light it is going to let and illuminate the scene. Most CG lights have an exposure control, but it's really like a secondary multiplier, almost like the way that we set up our rendering. You've got the camera AA, which is the master multiplier of all the other samples. The problem with doing that is it doesn't really give you an honest understanding and value of what the intensity needs to be. People get weirded out by, oh my God, my light's got 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 units. Well, that depends on the scale and size of your scene. Those units can be really big, and they will be really big when we get into bigger environments. So we do use exposure, but as a way to increase all the lights at once. So the great thing about exposure is you set all your lights up individually, get all the intensity set up so they all balance out. The key lights bright, the fill lights the way you want it, the back lights, kick lights, all the other lights are nice, they're in balance. But the director comes in and goes, great job, but we need more intensity in the scene globally. Well, instead of going into each individual light, you go in and adjust the exposure and increase the amount of light in one shot. So all the lights get affected. Or they come in and go, too bright, knock it down. So then you lower the exposure on all the lights. Does that make sense? So CG lights, like I said, the intensities can be really big, but don't let those units frighten you. Some people think that they have to keep all their light intensities from 0 to 1. That's not the way it works at all. Some people will go, oh, yeah, turn up exposure this way I can keep my light between 0 and 1. Why would you want to do that? You don't know how bright it is, really. It's artificially giving you a number that really means nothing in the scheme of the whole environment. So if you have any questions, please ask. You may use exposure in other classes, but for our class, we're just trying to teach best practices. So don't use any exposure. Any questions? Anybody? Exposure bad. Intensity good. All right. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to be doing today. And then we'll get into demoing everything. So you guys are good with rendering. You're good at getting a render out. You're good at putting it in the template, all that good stuff. So our job today is really just to acquaint you with the controls and the lights. This way, the whole idea for this project really is to kind of play around with the controls and the lights, see how the lights function, see what they do, and practice light direction, light intensity, light color, and shadow quality. These are all going to be visual skills. It's just like drawing. You have to worry about the same stuff when you draw, only this time instead of pencil, charcoal, paint, whatever you use to describe your scene or your subject in your artwork, we're just doing it on a computer. All right, so we're going to give you guys scenes. There's your reading, if anybody's interested. Here's our video links. There's the Arnold render doc. All right, so here are a couple things to keep in mind when you get started. Make sure you set your project to the proper project folder. You guys are going to recreate each reference image that you select, and you're going to have some choices. You're going to verify when you create your lights, verify that cast shadows is turned on in the Arnold attribute of each light. Now, the reason I'm having you do this is for your stuff, it should be on by default. But if you ever get a scene file from somebody that your job is to consequently light, they may have by default turned off shadows for whatever reason in the attributes. So when you create a light, it automatically creates it without shadows turned on. Or they may have a bunch of lights in there that they say, I just need you to tweak these lights, but they may have a bunch of lights without shadows turned on for whatever reason. So always verify it's turned on. Each render that you do needs to be a basic light type and a different light direction. So in the end, you will use all 4 lights and they will be all different directions. You're going to be using IPR for a quick setup. That's going to be super simple. You load your reference in. That's pretty easy. If you need to add color in the light, you're going to keep the value, which is the lightness and darkness of your color. Remember, Maya uses HSV, hue, saturation, and value. Value is lightness and darkness in the color. Keep your color value close to 1. If you don't do that, it will look like your light intensity is turned down, because that value can make your light look like the intensity is lower than it really is, because you're adding shadow or darkness into the light. So basically, you crank up the light but turn down the value. It's sort of like turning down the intensity. You're going to assign an AI standard surface to all your geometry. You need to turn off specular weight in it so it's not shiny, and make the base color 50% gray or 0.5 value. Like I said, Arnold, for whatever reason, likes really, really light gray, like 0.8 gray, which is just, that's not like a standard thing. I don't know why. Another thing to verify in Maya, in the Maya preferences, there's a section called color management. make sure color management is enabled. If you don't do that, your scene will look really dark and you're not going to be able to match the reference. I'm mentioning that because public service announcement, the files I give you don't have color management turned on. The reason I did that is because prior to Maya 2016, color management was not turned on in Maya by default like it is now. You may get old scenes wherever you go to work or from somebody. You may download them off the internet for free. Color management won't be turned on in old versions of Maya. And that will definitely cause you problems with modern workflow because everybody uses color management now. It's just the way to make things look better with any monitor you use. All right, so having said all that, I'm going to go through when I demo, I'm just going to show you guys where this stuff is so you can make sure you look out for it. All right, so you're going to be doing the area light first. You're going to make an AI area light, and you're going to choose whether you do the front or the top light direction for it. So direction, intensity, color. You can see there's definitely some color happening here. Now, if you choose to do the front light, the very next exercise you have, which is a directional light, you have to do the top. If you choose to do the top light in the area light, you do the front light in the directional light. Does that make sense? It's going to be the, when you get to the next light, if you have two similar choices, it's going to be the opposite of the one you did. This way, at the very end of it, each light direction has a different light type in it. So you move on to the point light. Point light, you got a choice of side or back. So if you do the back light for the point, you must do the side light for the spotlight. If you do the side light for the point, you need to do the back light for the spotlight. And at the end, 4 different light types, 4 different light directions. Does that make sense? Questions about the Zoomosphere? Katie's good. Okay, good. Now you can see the first 3 lights use the same scene. It's basically a bunch of really simple children's blocks stuck with a seamless background. And you can see just changing the light direction, the light intensity and light color can change the mood of those objects. Now, in number 4, the spotlight, I basically got tired of that scene and made another scene, so that's why you have a separate scene for this. A little bit different composition, still really just basic shapes that we're working with, trying to match shadows. So the object is match the shadows. We're telling you where the light roughly is positionally, back, side, top, front. Then your job is to put it in front if it's in the front and try to match up the shadows as best you can. Get the intensity, get the color, and then take a look at the shadow quality. Are the shadows soft? So for example, here in the first one, the area light, take a look at the difference in the shadows between the front light and the top light. The front light's got very soft shadows behind the subject. Whereas top light, the shadows are a little more formed. They're a little more coherent. They are a little bit harder. Now, with the directional light, no matter what you do, there's going to be fairly hard shadows because it's the sun. All right, so once you've done those, then you're going to create a composition using reference you found on the internet, photo reference. of a composition using a single light source. You're only allowed to use one light, and you must use one of our scenes and rearrange the geometry to get the look and feel of the reference. Very similar to what you did in project 1, but now you're responsible for the light and the color, in addition to the camera, the composition, and the rendering. Keep in mind, you can only use a single light, create a new camera, try to match the focal length, load your reference into the Arnold render view, or you can work side by side. It's up to you, whichever works better. Okay, you can move, you can scale geometry. You can't model anything or import anything from another scene. This is not a modeling exercise. This is lighting. Again, go for the overall look and feel and not so much pixel perfect. Now, to kind of give you guys an idea, I've got some samples from previous classes, just like I had for project 1. So this one is always a big favorite with film noir. Very simple, but pretty effective. So here's one. They got the vanishing point. You can spend as little time or as much time as you want on it, you know, really kind of getting that look and feel of the scene. And you can see all those trees creating parallel shadows. Kind of what we got going on there. This one, simple, bunch of screws, parallel light source for the most part. This one is a spotlight where they've actually been able to shape the spotlight, adjust the cone, which is the outer part of the spotlight, the size, make it soft, adjust it, kind of frame it up. So we don't condone smoking, but film noir, everybody smokes and drinks. Yeah, I mean, it's just, that's the way it was. So this one, actually, the background could be, I mean, that backlight could be a lot brighter. They could have staged it a little bit better here. But the camera angle and the actual focal length is pretty good. So here's one that really does a pretty good job using a single light describing foreground, midground, background. So you got foreground, character, foreground, backlight creates silhouette. You've got the center. You know, we don't have that volumetric effect where you've got the God rays coming down, but got the angle of the shadow pretty much where they should be coming down from. You got midground here, and then you got background. Again, shadows just a little bit softer than the reference, but still, all in all, pretty good. Really, really super simple, but they got the camera angle, they got the lighting, and you can clearly see it is related. It's got the look and feel of the reference. So another good one, got a nice kind of vanishing point there, heading off into the distance. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what you can do with your composition, your lighting comp. So use one of the templates, doesn't matter which one you use. Use one of our scenes, doesn't matter. Whatever one gives you the most varying geometric shapes that you can duplicate, scale, rotate, move around. All right, so the downloads, let me download this real quick, just so we can take a look at it. So here are the downloads. There's our Maya project folder, 2 scene files, one that says area directional point light. That is basically this for these 3 parts: area, directional, point, and then a different one for the spotlight, which is this one right here. Different scene, different files inside of it. Template, we have a separate template for each light type. So now there are 2 selections for each light. So they're both inside the template. You just need to turn on and off the reference that you either want or don't want. So it's going to be in a group. So for example, I'll open this one up. Should be pretty simple. Just go into the render layer group. Scroll down, there's a subgroup in there called reference images. Open that up. And basically, if you're not going to use the top light, you want the front light, turn off the top light. And you've got some basic information for the lights here. So for example, you've got intensity. How bright is your light? We're interested in that. We're still interested in rendering information. So I still need camera AA and diffuse samples, and then your render time. Now for the spotlight is a different beastie altogether. So spotlight, we're interested in intensity. We're still interested in samples, camera AA, diffuse time. But the spotlight has 3 controls that the other lights don't have. One is a cone, the angle of the cone, the size of that spotlight shape. We basically have penumbra angle, which is the softness on the edge of that spotlight cone. And then we have what's called drop off, which is how even is the light inside the cone. Like most flashlights, so for example, if I put my light here, let me see. Yeah, you guys can sort of see that even in zoom. All right, you can see that with a spotlight or flashlight or even your phone light, the light's always brighter in the middle and gradually gets less intense toward the edges. And with a phone, it's got a really open bulb, so the light spreads out really, really far. But you get the idea. It's not even all the way in that spotlight cone. All right, let's quit out of Photoshop for now because I want to run Maya at this, well, not at the same time, obviously. All right, and then we have reference images. So here's our area light. So area light, there's the front, there's the top version of it. We've got the directional, there's the front, there's the top version of that directional light. Here's the point light, this is the back, this is the side, here's the spotlight, this is the back, and this is the side. So you can load these into Arnold and then be able to compare your render and light position with the reference. All right, does that make sense? Questions? Anybody? All right. So what I'm going to do is start up Maya, and then I'll let you guys decide which light you would like to look at first. So we got a choice between directional, point, spot, and area light. And it's not a Maya area light, it's an Arnold AI area light. It's got a few more controls than the Maya version and is a lot more physically accurate looking compared to real world. All right, wait, I thought I started Maya. Come on, work with me here, Autodesk. All right, let's bring all this stuff down here, get it out of the way. Okay, there we go. Let me just take a quick screen in case I missed anybody. Okay. So what I'm going to do for the light demo is use a simple plane and 3 spheres. So if anybody wants to follow along, please feel free to. Simple polyplane, let's create that. Scale it up, going to make it fit the grid. That's all I'm going to do. I'm going to create a couple of spheres with their default size. And by default, you can see they're kind of buried halfway in the ground. Just going to translate them 1 unit in Y. That way they sit on the ground rather than halfway in it. And I'm going to duplicate that. All right, so I have 3 spheres. Yeah, let's throw on a resolution gate so I know exactly what it's going to look like when it renders. I'm not even going to save this scene because this is disposable. This is purely just to demonstrate how the lights work and what they do and look like when they actually hit a surface. All right, so one of the first things you want to do whenever you're working with a scene that's got basic geometry in it is you want to select all the geometry in your scene and assign a brand new Arnold AI surface. That is the standard surface we use. Now, there is a standard surface in there, but it's not the AI standard surface. So what I want you to do when you do assign something is there's a couple of ways you can assign a material. So first, I'm going to select all the objects. I could do it in the outliner. I can marquee select it inside the viewport. It doesn't really matter. So I can right click, but sometimes right clicking, you can see I got some issues here with, there we go. So I can go and create a new material. That's one way. Now, if you go down to assign favorite, right, there's a standard surface, but that's not an Arnold standard surface. That's a Maya standard surface. So don't use that one. And you can see standard surface, and there's a Lambert. Easiest way is assign new material. That will bring up the assign new material window. Go to Arnold shader, and you want the AI standard surface here. This is really the only material we're going to be using all month. This is the Swiss Army knife of materials. With this material, you can pretty much make anything from human skin to glass to metal to concrete, wood. Yes. you can assign one AI surface to all the geometry at once. Now, later on, when we actually get into materials, each surface will have its own material because it will have unique properties like reflectivity, transparency, color. But for now, everything's going to be the same. So do we have to assign it to the seamless backdrop? Yes, all objects in the scene. Now, the seamless backdrop might be a NURB surface, or it might be a poly surface, depending on the scene file. It doesn't matter, they still will work the same way. So don't be weirded out by the icon. Now, there's another way to assign a material besides right-clicking and assign new material. And this is my favorite way because it's lazy. And that is basically select all your geometry, hold the Shift key down, and hit the T key, T as in tango. So Shift plus T will bring up the assign new material, Shift T. So this way you just go down, select Arnold, go to AI standard surface. This way you don't have to right click, hold the button down. You can just bang on the keyboard and click. So once you click, that will assign all objects with the same AI standard surface. So now if we go under the AI standard surface attributes, in the attribute editor, you'll see that the base color is almost white. So the base color here, base color, click on it. You want to change that value to 0.5. That will change it to be 50% gray. One other thing after that, specular weight. Turn that off. That's basically shutting down all the shiny parts so that we have a diffuse material. And that's what we're going to work with, a diffuse material only. And pretty much we're set to go once you do that. Now, when you open a new scene, here's the one other thing I want you to check, and that's color management. So I just created a brand new scene here. So a brand new scene should have color management turned on by default. So to check it, we go Windows, Settings, Preferences, Preferences. In the left under Categories, we go Color Management, and just make sure Enable Color Management is checked on. So if it's off, look how dark my scene got. You try to bring reference images in with that turned off, and they are not going to look anything like they do if you open them off the desktop. All right, so just make sure it's enabled. Hit save. Life is good. All right, any questions about the AI standard material? It's pretty much going to be the same drill for the next couple projects. Assigning everything, turn the base color value down to the appropriate numbers. They are going to change a little bit when we get into an environment. But all the other stuff as far as color management and turning off specular weight is all the same. So questions? Anybody? Everybody good? Okay, all good. Thank you. Okay, so let's pick a light. Actually, I'll let you guys pick it. Which basic light type should we do first? So we got spotlight. We got to vote for a spotlight. Well, that looks like you're the only vote, so you win. So we will, we'll get to the others. It's just that this is the one we're going to do first. Okay, so a spotlight we create by going to Create, Lights, and Spotlight. That's going to drop a spotlight in at the center of the world. Now you'll notice at the top of the spotlight attributes, you've got color, you've got intensity. Don't worry about decay. Decay is automatically handled by Arnold. All the Arnold stuff down here. And we've got cone angle, penumbra angle, and drop off. All right, these are pretty much the last things you worry about with a spotlight. You still want to get the direction of the light. Is it front? Is it top? Is it side? Is it back? The cone is just going to determine how much light is visible in that round cone pattern. And spotlights can be round, they can be elliptical. You can think of it as you go watch a stand-up comedy or go to see a show, and they're always following the comedian around on the stage with a single spotlight. All right, now we've also got a section down a little further in the Arnold area. And this gives us a lot more advanced controls. So this takes the Maya spotlight and then gives it superpowers, sort of. All right, we're not using exposure, so that's right out. We can use color temperature, but we're not going to get into that today. Color for us is going to come from the color attribute at the very top. Color temperature is going to be more for environments when we get in there and we're dealing with natural light. Artificial light, which is usually what you see in a film shoot, photography setup, those lights are usually controlled with what are called gels. Photographer will put colored material in front of the light that's non-flammable, and that will color the light. A lot of times you don't buy different color light bulbs. For one thing, you don't want to take the time to change them. And bulbs are really expensive in photography. Anything with the name photography in it costs 4 times more than a consumer light bulb at Lowe's or Home Depot or Walmart. Because they're color balanced, they've got certain color temperature, and in theory, they hold to a higher standard than just, your average Sylvania bright white light. So, having said all that, blah, 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 let's see what this looks like when we hit the render button. I'm leaving it at the default position. So render, and whoa, where'd it go? Well, one thing is it's stuck inside the geometry. So let's pull it up out of the ground a little. You can see I got a little bit of this object right here visible. So let me pull it back, and you can kind of see I'm just kind of dragging it across the top. You can see the little bit of light that hits my objects is very dark. So the default intensity on any light when you're using Arnold is going to be pretty low. That's like a 1 watt light bulb, which, you'd be lucky if you could see it. Now, the further away it gets, obviously it's not aimed at an object, so we don't see anything if I move it up out of the way. So the thing about a spotlight is rotation. Rotation is the key to getting the spotlight to aim where you want it to. All right, so let me turn on rotation here. So you can see as I aim it down, I can make it hit the ground. Pull it up a little bit. Let's aim it down again. A little bit more, but you can see it's really dim. So I'm going to crank up the intensity. Let's try 10. So not bad. Little dark. I'm going to crank it up to 100. There we go. Now I got some light. So there's my spotlight. So I can move this around any direction I want. But here's the thing. Just using rotation sometimes doesn't really get you to aim the spotlight really where you want it to. So there is something called an interactive manipulator that we can activate for the light. So let me stop the render for a second. So the interactive manipulator can be accessed by hitting the T key. Not Shift, not T, but you must select the light first. Then hit the T key. And here's what happens. So I go select my light, hit T, and then I get this little thing that creates a center of interest. So my spotlight is following it around. Now I can stick this, say, at the center of my subject, and then the spotlight will follow it around. So center of interest, the spotlight is always going to be aimed at that center of interest. Now, when you're done, you can hit W, E, or R to get to rotate, translate, and scale, or, translate, rotate, and scale, whatever you want. But T, that's kind of like where a lot of time can be saved, making sure the light is going where you want it to. So now I can move this light around, like I said. If I move that center of interest, the light's going to follow it. All right, does that kind of make sense so far? All right, so light direction, translate, rotate, scale actually does nothing to the light other than maybe on a few Maya lights, it'll let you scale the icon, like here. This will let me scale the icon, but it's not going to change the light. It's only going to change how big that icon is. So if you're doing a really giant scene and you make an area light, by default, it's a little teeny tiny thing. Scale it up so it's easy to work with. Or if it's too big, scale it down. Make it easier to work with. But it does not affect the light. You can see, I can change that scale, but that light doesn't change. The shadow does nothing. And if you ever want to get back to the defaults, just go back to your channel box and just set your scale back to 1. So, aiming the light, very important. Intensity, well, we got an intensity slider here. Don't rely on the slider, they're garbage. A lot of times they'll only go up to 1 or 10 or something, but they can go well beyond that just by typing a number into the attribute. I don't even bother using the slider because they kind of annoy me. All right, now, light direction, light intensity, check. How about light color? All right, well, that's pretty simple. All I have to do is click in the slider. I'm going to keep my value at 1 because I want nice, clear, bright light. And I'm going to change the hue. Let's make it kind of orangey. And I need to add a little bit of saturation. So notice the more saturation I add, the more dominant that color is going to get. And if you have too much saturation, it looks really cartoony. So we usually keep our saturation somewhere between like 0.2, 0.3 for a nice kind of subtle look with the light. So if I want it to be cool, well, we can go sort of greenish. Now, every zombie hospital that you've ever been in playing a game is pretty much that green fluorescent light, makes you look sick. Right? But you can make it cooler, go into the blues. And anytime you want to get back to pure white light, easiest way, and I mean the easiest way, is in the attribute, grab that color slider, drag it left and right, and that resets the light to white, which is really nice to know. Because a lot of time people will agonize in here going, I'm trying to get my hue back to 0 and my saturation and my value, and just drag the slider. Drag that main color slider. It's a lot easier. All right, so we got light direction, light intensity, light color. How about that shadow quality? Right now, we've got razor sharp shadows. You will cut your finger on those shadows. They are that sharp. Now, normally, on a real light in the real world, we would scale the light. A bigger light makes a softer light. A smaller light makes a harder light. But here, scaling the icon does absolutely nothing. So we use this little feature down under the Arnold attribute called radius. Radius, okay, so here's the theory behind the Maya spotlight and the Maya point light. They are infinitely small points in space, and consequently, infinitely small points in space mean you have a hard light no matter what you do to it. So the difference between a point light and a spotlight is the point light just emits light in all directions. A spotlight has the cone. That point is all the way in the back of the cone, and it's forced to go in the direction of the cone. That's how it gets the shape of the light. Now, in order to make that light seem bigger than infinitely small, we use something called radius, which tells the light to behave bigger than it actually is. So you'll notice if I change this, if I start increasing the radius, look at the edges of my shadow. My shadow edges get softer. Now, notice the cone doesn't get any softer. That's a separate control. Just the shadow that the light casts. You can have a little bit, you can have a lot, but it comes turned off. So far, so good? Makes sense? Okay. So here's something else to consider. And in that spotlight now, we've got a cone angle, cone penumbra drop off. So if you need the size of that spotlight circle to be bigger or smaller, you adjust the cone. And here's the way the cone works. It's in degrees. So 40 means you've got basically a 40-degree cone angle. Yeah, sort of like that. Now, if you had 90, it would sort of look like that. Break my fingers. But, so if I want the spotlight to be bigger, take in more of an area, make the cone bigger. If you go all the way to, well, basically 180, you have a flat light. You've lost that cone shape. Now, you can even go smaller. So really a flexible tool to have with this light. That's how you change the size of the area that the spotlight lights. Now, to change the softness on the edge of that cone, that's penumbra angle. And notice my slider for the penumbra is right in the middle. That means I can go outward and it softens outward. Or I can take away from the cone and go in the negative direction, and it softens my light inwards. So by default, you get a penumbra angle or cone softness at 0. Now, between adjusting the penumbra and adjusting the drop off, so notice how touchy that drop off is. That drop off is basically, let me just go 0.1. And the thing about the drop off is it almost negates what's going on with the cone angle. There we go. It looks like we've made the cone smaller and softer at the same time, but really we're keeping the light bright in the middle, but it's getting less intense toward the edges. That's hence the name drop off, or sometimes called fall off. So, spotlight cone angle makes it bigger. Penumbra makes the edges softer. So drop off changes how even the intensity is inside the cone. Now, principles of light for a spotlight are a little bit different. I'll probably go over this a couple times. All right, so principles of light, right? You got light direction. Always go with that first. Intensity. Color. Josh, good question. Is it better to use penumbra or drop off? It depends on what your reference shows you. If you're using penumbra, that's going to soften the edges of the cone. But it doesn't change how even the light is inside the cone. That's drop off. So some reference, you may have drop off in there and you may not. But yeah, kind of artistically have to look at it like, okay, I see my edges are soft, but is the light even inside that cone or inside the softness area that you can have? So in mine, I've got both. It's really bright in the center, but less intense. And I've also got cone softness in here. So shadow quality. So soft shadows equal big light, big or close light. Hard light or hard shadows equals small or distant light. With a spotlight, after you've got all these features, then you worry about the cone angle. How big is my cone? How big is the area that my spotlight is covering? Cone softness, which is basically penumbra angle. and then drop off. How even is the intensity in the cone? So principles of light that apply to any light are going to be the first four. But the spotlight's got some unique features that you worry about. Right? Does that make sense? Questions? Josh, did that answer your question? Okay. So let's take a look at our exercise, and I want to kind of drive home this whole principle right here with these two exercises. So the way to approach working on these exercises would be to get the light direction first. So side, match the shadows up, ignore everything else. Match the shadows. Get the shadows long. If your shadows are too short, that means the light's too high up. Lower the light a little bit. That'll make the shadows a little bit longer. Move the light around, get the shadows in there. Get the intensity, get the color if there is any. One on the left, questionable. One on the right, definitely not the same as the one on the left. One on the right looks a little warmer. So then shadow quality. Are my shadows hard or are they soft? Well, these look a little bit hard, but they're not razor sharp. There's a little bit of softness to the edges here. Now, once you've got those four principles down, then you go, how big is my cone? If your shadows are in the right place, when you change the cone size, that will fall into place. If you get those shadows, the cone comes naturally. Now, you make it big enough, and by big enough, kind of say, well, it looks like my cone is all the way out here. On this one, for sure, out there, a little bit over here, a little bit back there. This one, you can see it's sort of here. Then cone softness. How soft are those edges? Well, they're soft, but they're not like super soft. And then how even is my light inside the cone? So here, it looks like it's sort of pretty even, as opposed to over here where this feels like it's brighter in the middle and kind of gets less intense toward the edges. So spotlight is probably, the reason that's number 4 on your list is because you've had a chance to practice the others first. Spotlight takes a little more time to do because you've got more attributes to worry about. But don't be intimidated by it. Do the steps in order. Get the shadows, get the intensity, get the color, get the shadows, then work on the cone part. All right. You kind of clear the decks there. Let's go back here. All right. So kind of did the demo on the spotlight. So spotlight is disposable. Bye-bye. No. Yes. Gone. All right. So what light do we want to do next? So spotlight checked. We got directional, point, area. All right, we got to vote for directional. Anybody else? Oh, we got rock, paper, scissors war coming. We got point light versus directional light. Whoa, wait, let me take a vote here. All right, so we got point and we got directional. So I got 2 for point, 2 for directional. Ooh, we got 3 for point. Ooh, we got another directional. And I heard another directional back there. And I heard, wait, you can't see, no double voting. Okay, your first time. All right, so we got 4 and 4. Oh, Jerry wants a point. There's 5. Deja wants a point. We're up to 6. Going once, going twice. All right, looks like point light wins out. But that's all right, we'll do directional next. So it's all good. All right, so point light, very simple. We go create lights, point. Drops it in, center of the world. Hit the render button. Nothing happens. Why? Because it's a teeny tiny little point of light that's buried inside the geometry. So let's pull it out and see what we get. There we go. Now, obviously, you can see the light gets less intense the further we pull it away. So let's just kind of drop it on the top up there, and let's crank up the intensity. There we go. So you can see with this light, illuminates in all directions. If I had stuff behind it, on top of it, everything would be illuminated. And you can see that since it's directly overhead of that center sphere, the light patterns kind of fan out. The shapes fan out, causing the shadows to fan out also. And you know what? Let's crank it up again. There we go. Now it's bright. So we can move it around, we can change the shadows. Pretty simple. So if I rotate this light, what do you think will happen? Yeah, pretty much nothing is going to happen. Why? Well, because it already emits light in all directions. And if you rotate it around, you're just going to anger the Maya gods. That's all. Yes. That's, you anger them enough and then they make Maya crash. Yeah. So, I mean, nothing bad will happen. It's just that you put transforms in for absolutely no reason. Why bother? All right, so how about scale? Let's scale this light. So rotation, no effect at all. Let's scale. Well, that's 18. How about 1,000? Nope, didn't do anything. So scaling, absolutely a joke. What really matters? Translation. Positioning that light where you want it. All right, so that's pretty simple, actually. I mean, you could use the T key for this also, but really, since rotating it doesn't really matter, you may as well just translate it where you want it to. But theoretically, I could hit the T key, and there's my interactive manipulator. And I move it around, and absolutely nothing happens. So why hit the T key? Well, it makes everybody feel good. Okay, sure. Well, one way, though, is if you want to anchor it, you can shift it. But honestly, it's not really doing anything any different than if I just translate it this way. So We figured out how to move it. It's pretty simple. Translation. Intensity, pretty self-explanatory. Make it bright. Color, same color kind of combination as we had, or the same way to apply color that we did in the spotlight. Color attribute, keep the value up, change the hue, little bit of saturation to get the color you want. The more color, that's going to be dominant. That's going to be saturation. All right. So under the Arnold attributes, we have the same radius control. This works almost identically to the spotlight because they're related. Spotlight has a point light in the back of the cone. A point light is just a bare point light shining in all directions like a bare light bulb, but this is how we soften our shadows. This is how we make the light look more realistic. All right, so I just threw a little softness on there, just give it a little, take the edge off of some of those shadows. All right, so that's pretty much it. But there is one other little hidden thing that I want to show you, and that's making the light visible to the camera. If you want to make the light visible to the camera, down under the Arnold attributes, there's visibility. And notice that visibility is at 0 for the camera. So if I turn it up to 1, it should make my light visible. But you'll notice that I don't see my light. That's because it has a radius of 0. If I increase the radius a little bit, then all of a sudden it pops in. And notice when I make the radius bigger, it softens my shadows. Guess what happens if I make the radius too big? Well, you can't see your geometry, or let me translate this down, kind of show you what happens if you make it too big. You're going to wind up cutting off part of your geometry. So visibility of your light is going to visibility of your light is going to affect your shadows and where the light's positioned. Your shadows are controlled by the radius, but so is the size of your visible light. So you got to make sure the two are in sync. Let me stop that. Let's turn off the radius. Going to turn off the camera for a second. Let's just render that again. Pull that up. There we go. All right, so you want to make the light visible to the camera. Down under the Arnold attribute, visibility, turn the camera all the way up. You have to give it a little bit of radius so that it has some physical size, because otherwise it will be 0, which is infinitely small. And you would think like lowering the camera visibility will make it somehow translucent or transparent. It doesn't do that. You just reach a point where it goes off. So I don't know why they just don't have a switch that turns it on and off. So you might need this. You won't need it for our exercises, but you might need a visible light that you see in your reference. Might be a street light overhead or the moon or something that you're using for your composition. And remember to control the size of it. That's radius, but that also changes the size or changes your shadows. Right, does that make sense? Questions? All right. So let's do the directional light next. So I'm just going to delete this light. Gone. Let's create lights, directional light. Hit render, and you'll see by default, even though it's buried in the ground, I have my left sphere visible. Now that's weird. Why does it not, or why is it even displaying? Like all the other lights, it should be obscured by that geometry. Anybody? How about out there in the zoomosphere? Aha. It's a global, or sometimes called an infinite light, kind of like our sun. So what that means is no matter where we put this light, I can pull it up out of the ground. It's still going to do the same thing. I can translate it wherever I want. I could put it all the way over in the corner somewhere. Nothing. Translation doesn't really matter at all with this light. That's because it's an infinite wall of light coming from the direction those arrows are pointed. And the reason we don't see any of the ground plane that I have the sphere sitting on is because those light rays are parallel. They're skipping right across the top. So this light is all about rotation. Once I start to rotate that light, more and more of those parallel light rays are going to hit it. And as the shadows start to go underneath my subjects, it gets brighter and brighter, kind of like noontime during the day with the sun. Now notice this is probably the brightest light that we've seen so far by default. And again, that's because it's an infinite light. It's like the sun. But it doesn't mean that this will always be as bright as what you need. You know, you still can make it brighter, but the numbers are not going to be nearly as big since it is an infinite light as some of those smaller light types, like the point light, like the spotlight. And you'll see the Arnold AI area lights, pretty much the same thing. Now, by default, you will get razor sharp shadows. To adjust that, well, you scale the light, the shadows are not going to change. You're only scaling the icon. So again, based on the scale of your scene, you might need to make it a little bigger or a little smaller so that it's easy to manage in your scene. So to make the shadows softer, we go under the Arnold attribute and we go to something called angle. And this is a lot like our sun, where based on the angle of the sun, the shadows get softer. Now, most software packages have a default angle in there already, and that is usually 0.5. Arnold chose not to have anything, which I don't know why, but if you put in 0.5, the shadows based on the angle of the light will soften, which is kind of nice. So let me turn this off for a second. And let me zoom in on one of these lights or one of these spheres. There we go. Ooh, that's really faceted. There we go. Let's hit the 3 key, get a little faux resolution in there. Pull that down. There we go, just so I can see it. All right, so let's change the angle to 0.5. Doesn't look like it did a whole lot. Well, that's because the sun is directly overhead. And usually directly overhead, the shadows are really short and really hard. Now watch as I change the angle of this light, meaning I change the rotation of it. So as I start to rotate it, the edges start to get just a little soft. The more I rotate it, they get softer still. So this behaves with the angle at 0.5, it behaves a lot like the real sun. So I always recommend just put this angle at 0.5 when you use a directional light or the sunlight, and whatever rotation you have it, it will behave like it should in the real world. All right, now you can change the color of the sun, obviously. If you want to make it cooler, you can make it behave sort of like a moon, although the moon technically is not a light source. It is a big bounce card in the sky, bouncing light off the sun. But you get the idea. So notice there is no visibility slider for the camera for the sun. The sun is basically going to be visible in your reflections, but not visible in the sky directly to the camera. We have other ways to do that. They're called dome lights with high dynamic range images in them. And that gives us a background. All right, does that make sense? Any questions? Directional light. Pretty simple, actually. Just remember rotation, change the angle down under the Arnold attribute to 0.5, and that'll give you soft shadows based on the rotation of your sun that more or less mimic the real world. Intensity, change the color. Now, if you want to stylize it and make the shadows even softer, well, you can increase that angle beyond, but then you're going to kind of break the reality we're trying to do. But if it's stylized, it's all right. All right. So one more light, and that is our Arnold light. That's the only light that we access inside the Arnold shelf. So let me delete this light. There we go. And the Arnold AI area light is the very first icon all the way on the left of the shelf. Right. Oh, come on. You're supposed to give me my, there we go, drawing tool. So there you go. So let's create that area light. Let's hit the render button. Now, this light, by default, will be covered up by the geometry. So we have to pull this up out of the ground. And for all you interactive manipulator fans out there, I got some bad news for you. Our interactive manipulator tool does not work in the Arnold light, which is really silly. So I select the light, hit the T key, but it doesn't give me the interactive manipulator. So with this light, you need to actually rotate it to get it where you want it to go. But I'm going to show you that, you know, a lot of times that rotation we can kind of get away with adjusting with translation. All right, so again, this light is, let's crank it up. There we go. All right, so notice that the shadows by default are soft. That is because, well, I'm going to crank this up even more. Well, that might be a little too much. No, that's still too bright. All right, so here, notice that the area light, for one thing, is flat. It's got a little pointer that tells you the direction it's illuminating. And notice it does not illuminate anything behind it. So scaling the light will change how soft the shadows are. This is one of our physical lights, which means we can physically change the size of it. So the smaller I make this light, the harder the shadow edges are. If I make it big, the shadows get soft. So translation, rotation, scale is how we adjust the shadow quality. Translation, rotation, there's your light direction. Light intensity, pretty simple. Light color, same place, get it through the color attribute. And you have your shadow quality through scale. Does that make sense? So, like I said, this is the only light that scale makes a difference for the shadows. It behaves like a real world light. Bigger the real world light is, the softer it's going to be. Now, for this light has exposure right underneath intensity. So fight the urge to play with that. Down here, you've got a choice. Let me take a snapshot of this light. All right, so there's a snapshot. We've also got the ability to change the shape of the light to be a disk, which means that we get a round surface rather than a square shape. All right, so difference, slightly difference in the look, or a slight difference in the look. So here's our quad. Let's do a disk. So you can see the shadows change just a little bit based on the shape of that light. It's very, very subtle, but it does change a little bit. So if your reference calls for a round light, you got a disk. If it calls for an area, a square, a rectangle, and as you see when we get into analyzing lights in Project 3 for a portrait, we're going to be using what are called softboxes, which are basically area lights that photographers use. That would be a quad. Now, we've also got the ability to have a cylinder. But notice the cylinder really changes the quality of your light. And it also causes a void wherever the cylinder end is aimed, because it is not a solid cylinder, it is a hollow cylinder. So consequently, I have yet to find a really good use for this shape of light. Quite frankly, if I need a light with an unusual shape, we will use mesh lights, which I'll show you guys when we get into lighting in interior and exterior environments. So for the area light, quad or disc. Most of the time, quad, unless you've got a visible shape that you want to change. Now, here's the other thing. This light you can make visible to the camera. And if I change the shape of that light, well, guess what? The visibility is going to change as well. Now, one thing you got to keep in mind, and that is if your light is not facing the camera, you're not going to see it. If I turn it sideways, guess what? It's not pointed at the camera. You can't see it. So if you're having visibility issues with a light, make sure it's aimed at the camera in some way. All right, does that make sense? Questions? Okay, questions out there in the Zoomosphere? Everybody good? Jerry's good. Thank you, Jerry. Deja's good. Thank you, Deja. All right. So one last thing I want to do is just kind of give you a quick run through on the workflow for project 2. So first thing I'm going to do, set my project. Set project right there. So I've got mine stuck inside downloads. There's my Maya project folder. And let's open the area directional point scene. And I'll kind of give you a rundown here. If you get this error saying, hey, there's an error reading this scene, you can just ignore it. I don't know why it's there. I thought I had it fixed last month. It was fine. Now, all of a sudden this month, it's being Maya. All right, so a couple things about this scene. First off, wireframe. You're going to be in the render cam. I personally like to work outside of the render cam in perspective. So you'll notice it's kind of like Stonehenge in a bowl. Part of this complete breakfast, just add milk. Now, I'm going to hit the 5 key. You'll notice the camera can see through the geometry there. But if you're inside the bowl, you can't see the camera. You can't see outside. You don't know you're in a bowl. This is your whole world. All right, so it's just a little single-sided visibility wizardry there. That's all, just to make it easy for the comp. So first thing you want to do when you start working, obviously follow the directions in FSO. That will make your life so much easier, right? You want to select all the geometry, which I'm going to do in the outliner. So there's the group and there's the bowl. So I'm just going to select both of them and then do Shift T to bring up my assign new material, Arnold, shader. We're going to choose an AI standard. Okay, so don't forget, first thing you want to do, change the base color to 0.5 value. .5, there we go. Wow, that got dark. All right, let's go back. Don't forget, turn off specular weight. If you just select one object and turn it off, don't worry. You've assigned one material to all the objects, so whichever one you choose, you're still altering that image. Or sorry, you're still altering the material. All right, now, notice how very dark it is. What you want to do is go into the Maya preferences, Windows, Settings, Preferences, and go to Color Management and turn on Color Management. If you don't, you're not going to be able to match anything properly. So hit Save, and let's do a Save As. And I'm going to demo the directional light because it's really quick and we're running out of time. So let me do that. 2021-08. Save. Now it's giving me an issue. It doesn't want to save. All right, let's save again. Find out what happened. Well, I'm trying to save it as a binary, but the original is ASCII, so let's switch. Let's change it to ASCII. If you ever have that problem, just try changing the type of Maya file. So let's try that again, 2021-08. Let's hit save. Life is good. There we are. So when you're opening the scene up, select all the geometry, assign a new AI standard surface, base color, put the value at 0.5, turn off the specular weight, and turn on color management. So now we're going to add a light, but let's pick out the light we're going to do. Well, we're going to do a directional light. So should I do the front or the top? All right, I heard top. Let's do top. I'm going to open up my Arnold render view. And actually what I'm going to do is bring my reference in first. This way I know exactly what I'm doing. What's that? He already said top. He wins. Nice try. Late to the party. You got to buy pizza and beer. Yeah. Okay, crackers and water. That's cheap pizza. We got some ketchup laying around and some old Velveeta, so we got pizza. All right, so file, open image. Let's go to the reference. We want directional light. There's the front, there's the top. Let's load that in. There we go. All right, so right there, the direction should tell you top light. I'm going to make a directional light. So let's go create lights directional. I'm going to pull it up out of the ground. Does it really matter? No, because rotation is really all that matters with this light. And let's make sure we're rendering from the render cam. And since it says top light, where should my arrows aim? Down. Make sure you keep your mask on. All right, down. So let's rotate. Ooh, feel like 2001: A Space Odyssey. Okay. So let's aim it down, kind of get our shadows tucked under as best we can. Let's see. Sort of around there. All right. Not bad. Just kind of rotated them by eyeball so they were all tucked neatly underneath. And it looks like my light position is pretty close. Now I got to worry about light intensity. So looks like my light could be a little brighter. So let's try that. Okay, cranked it up a little. Not bad. I'm going to try and change the color and then see how my intensity looks, because changing the color can sometimes affect the brightness of your light also. So let's see. That's kind of pretty warm. Is that red warm? Let's see. No. Whoa. All right. So red warm, not really. Let's try pinky magenta looking. It's not too bad. Let's lower the saturation a little. Looks like it's maybe still a little saturated. Let's try. Now it's undersaturated. Bump it up a little. The color is not bad, but now it's starting to look a little dark. So I think I need it to be brighter. Too bright. Doesn't feel as bright. All right, so let's split the difference. Now I'm starting to look at it and go, oh, that looks a little more saturated right there on the ground. All right, let's bring that up. So now, just kind of playing around with the intensity, playing around with that color saturation, I can kind of fine tune it in there. Now, as far as my shadows go, honestly, since they're tucked right underneath of the subject, if I change this angle, I don't know if it's going to matter at all. No, I'm not really seeing a huge difference. So some instances you can get away with, it off. I like to leave it on no matter what I'm doing. So I got the light direction. That was pretty simple because straight overhead. We got the light intensity. We kind of got the light intensity. We adjusted the color, kind of got the color, bumped up the intensity a little more, adjusted the saturation of the color, bumped up the intensity more, too much, dropped it, played with the saturation until we got the right levels. And what I would do now is set it up for production quality render, put on denoise, and then put it into the template. So that's pretty much the workflow. So when you're working with like the area light, take your time because the front area light's going to have pretty soft shadows. So you want to make sure that, get the direction of the shadows first, get the intensity, then worry about how soft the shadows are. All right, so same thing with the point light, side, back. Any questions? Does that make sense? Right? Any questions out there in Zoom? All right, Jerry's good. Thank you, Jerry. All good. Like I said, take your time. All right, guys, thanks for hanging in there with me. Let's go. All right. Yeah, by the time we get out of here, it'll be 5:10. So come back to lab at 6:10. Go have a nice dinner, take a break. Lab will start at 6:10. And I will see you guys on Friday.